For the first time in ages, reasons to be cheerful. Vaccines are coming. This isn't going to go on forever. Winter is going to end. What then? Well, right through next year, we are going to be talking about the economic consequences of COVID-19. This year's government borrowing is at a scale we just haven't seen in Britain outside of 2 world wars. Somehow, £200 billion is going to have to be paid back. How? An enormous dilemma. This morning, I'm joined by the Chancellor as we try to find out what's ahead for all of us. The man still, for now, the most popular senior politician in the country, Rishi Sunak, joins me live in the studio to discuss what we really mean by levelling up. Here too is the shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Anneliese Dodds, as Jeremy Corbyn is readmitted to the Labour Party but not given back the whip. But before they trade economic arguments, we need a bit of perspective. I've been talking to Paul Johnson, head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and as near as we get in this country to a neutral economic umpire. Also this morning, to remind us that this is about people, not about numbers, that glorious actor Dame Judi Dench making an appeal for the next generation. Reviewing the news this week, because it's also the last few days for the European trade talks. Yes, really, honestly, it is. Our Brussels editor, Katya Adler. And looking back on a week when Boris Johnson's been fighting to defend his Home Secretary over bullying accusations, Madeline Grant of the Telegraph. An interesting morning ahead. Let's start, as we always do, with the news and Ben Thompson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. A plan to lift England's lockdown on December the 2nd will be finalised by government ministers today. The Prime Minister is planning to replace the national lockdown with a stricter version of the 3-tiered system of restrictions, with more areas facing tougher rules, although pubs may be allowed to stay open beyond 10 p.m. Our political correspondent, Leila Nathu, reports.
What will Christmas look like this year? We'll soon find out. Tomorrow, Boris Johnson will confirm to Parliament that England is coming out of national lockdown on the 2nd of December and going back into regional tiers of coronavirus restrictions. The system will be stricter this time round, with more areas under tighter rules. Ministers will decide on Thursday which areas will go into which tier. But across all tiers, there will be special arrangements to allow families to meet over Christmas, and a 4-nation approach is still being discussed. We all want to see our loved ones again, but some are concerned about the consequences.
Any mixing that we see over the festive period, unfortunately, is going to carry with it a risk that we'll see a rise in infections afterwards. The levels of community transmissions that we're having at the moment are very serious. We don't know what they will be like in December, but it's almost certainly won't be like they were in the summer, where people were able to mix a little bit more. And remember that at the moment we're seeing a huge amount of hospitalizations and dozens and if not hundreds of deaths every day. And I think the price we might pay for this could be quite considerable.
The Cabinet will meet today to discuss the plans, and MPs will get to vote on whether to bring in the new system. Labour said it would look closely at the proposals, but said the new framework must bring certainty for businesses. Ministers are stressing this festive period won't be normal, but hope that vaccines and mass testing will offer a route towards relaxing restrictions further. Leila Nathu, BBC News.
The Chancellor is expected to pledge more than £3 billion to help the NHS in England recover from the pandemic. Rishi Sunak will announce the package in his spending review on Wednesday. But speaking to the Sunday Times, he says high levels of borrowing cannot go on indefinitely and warns that the UK is experiencing economic shock. Nearly all of California's 40 million residents are now living under a nighttime curfew in a bid to curb a steep rise in coronavirus infections. The new order, which follows similar measures in New York City, requires Californians to stay at home from 10 p.m. until 5 a.m. US health officials have also urged Americans to avoid travelling for the Thanksgiving holiday on Thursday. That's all the news from me for now. Andrew, back to you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to hope that you've already been out to buy the Sunday newspapers, but if you hadn't, here's what's on the front pages. The Sunday Telegraph, lockdown to end next week, as we were hearing on the news, but stricter tiers on the way. What does that mean? We're going to try and find out more later in the programme. The Sunday Express, lockdown ultimatum. That's about around 70 Tory backbenchers who are threatening to revolt against tough lockdown rules after the lockdown's over. Sunday Times has been talking, as we heard, to Rishi Sunak, who's going to be my guest later on, and he says, prepare for tax pain next year, warns Rishi Sunak. And again, I'll be asking him, of course, about that. The Observer has got a story. Johnson acted illegally, it says, over jobs for top anti-COVID staff. There's a lot in the papers generally about so-called cronyism. The Mail on Sunday, Boris to kill off the 10 p.m. curfew. You're going to be able to carry on drinking, it says, in some pubs around Britain at least, between 10 and 11. So an awful lot to talk about there. I'm joined from where she is by Madeline Grant and by Katya Adler, who is in Brussels. Madeline, let's start with you. Just talk us through what we're going to be seeing next week.
Well, it's a very busy week indeed, by the looks of things. The Sunday Telegraph reports that tomorrow the Prime Minister will confirm that the national lockdown will end on December the 2nd, but it will instead be replaced by a new, harsher system of tiers that could be decided regionally. And this is interesting in itself. It sort of begs the question of what in practice this means. Does lockdown end in practice, or is this a kind of lockdown in name only with a bow attached? Because discussing harsher tiers could mean, that in practice we end up with a very similar state of affairs to what we're currently living with. The Sunday Times looks ahead to the spending review next week, and speaking of which had already been trailed in the papers this week, the news that Rishi Sunak will be splurging heavily in all sorts of areas, but also stressing at the same time that we can expect heavy tax rises to be following, pretty soon. It does seem to be that this is being presented as the last big splurge before they then have to batten down the hatches again.
And there's been lots of speculation about capital gains tax and other specific taxes because, of course, the Conservatives are committed to not raising income tax, VAT and so forth.
Yes, and this seems to be very much the kind of tussling that we've heard about between Rishi Sunak, who is a bit more of a kind of hawk on the economy, and Boris Johnson, who I think is a big fan of, spending and sort of unveiling big projects and sort of trying to basically bread and circuses. And Rishi Sunak is the presence in cabinet to be a bit more kind of sobering. And he's reportedly looking at raising capital gains tax and cutting higher rate pensions relief, which is something the PM opposes. So you'd expect that tussling to continue.
Yeah. Sorry, Madeline. I know that you spend quite a bit of time talking to Tory MPs generally. How seriously should we take this business of a growing revolt against another period of tough restrictions up and down the country? Because a lot of Tory MPs are really upset about this, aren't they?
Yes, this is a group of 70 Tory MPs, which is a part of they call themselves the COVID recovery group. And they're saying that they won't support the Prime Minister with any further restrictions until the government has not just published their impact assessment of the economic harm it will cause, but also setting out why the restrictions won't potentially kill more people, do more harm than good. So this doesn't really change the mathematics in the Commons so much, because so far the Labour Party have very much supported the Prime Minister with all of his proposals. But I don't think it doesn't look good for the Prime Minister and his government to be so heavily reliant on the opposition. And I think that those 70 MPs represent a pretty sizable chunk of grassroots Tory opinion, as well as public opinion.
They have to be taken very seriously. And if you're wondering at home what the kind of arguments they're making, Steve Baker, who is a very well-known Brexiteer backbencher, tweeted this morning. You can see that there. So that is the sort of view that he's got at the moment. And a lot of Tory backbenchers would agree with him. Katya Adler, we tend to think that this is something that affects Britain, that the arguments about civil liberties and the economy versus the need to kind of push back down again over coronavirus before Christmas is something that affects us more. But it's all over the EU, isn't it? There's an interesting story here in the Sunday Times. It says, second wave pours cold water on Stockholm. Sweden, of course, had a very different approach, and Berlin approach. Katya.
Well, yes. I mean, you've got French and German newspapers today looking ahead to this week. Big statements expected from Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and from French President Emmanuel Macron as well. In the Süddeutsche Zeitung, you've got quite an emotive article saying, can Christmas still be saved? There's a lot of focus on the words of the leader of the sister political party to Angela Merkel's, Markus Söder. He's seen as a potential next German chancellor after she leaves leaves her position after elections next year, saying, if we want to enjoy Christmas in any way, we're going to have to extend the lockdown in Germany and possibly tighten restrictions as well. Le Monde picks up on words from the French health minister saying that French people should not expect any kind of normal Christmas this year. La Repubblica in Italy looks at the macabre dance of the virus, it says, through the country. It says the government is scouring for good news, but it, like other Italian papers, lament the fact that travel between Italian regions will be shut over the Christmas period, meaning that families will be separated. And you mentioned Sweden, Andrew. Of course, in the first wave of the lockdown, Sweden was hailed as an example where you could keep your civil liberties and keep the coronavirus in check. But we've seen the Swedish government introducing new rules on restaurants, on public gatherings as well, a ban on the sale of alcohol after 10 o'clock since Friday, and warnings that there could be travel restrictions for Swedes as well over the Christmas period, which is really obsessing all European newspapers this morning.
Well, how nice to have someone on the show who speaks and reads so many languages, Katya. Thank you very much indeed for that. Madeline, back to you, because the other big story this week politically has been about Priti Patel coming under an absolute savage series of attacks over her alleged bullying. She was found to have bullied and broken the ministerial code, but Boris Johnson has saved her. And if you look at the Sunday Times this morning, for instance, there's another very brutal-looking story. It says Priti Patel faces axe over her competence, not her temper. So the briefing against her carries on.
Yes, it does. And they're reporting that she could be shuffled from the Home Office to the position of party chairman at the next reshuffle. And as you say, pouring doubt on her level of competency, as well as the accusations of bullying that were being thrown around. And it's an interesting one, because it does seem to be the case that Priti Patel is very popular in the Tory party, and that so many ministers, the sheer volume of these kind of identical tweets that they got within hours of when the briefing started last week and the report was released. It seemed like there wasn't a Tory MP who hadn't met Priti Patel and noticed what an unbullying presence she was. So there was this sense of the wagons really circled to protect her, and the Prime Minister was busy WhatsApping everyone to tell them to do this. But equally, the position of party chairman is one that allows you to connect quite heavily with the grassroots, and she's very popular with the grassroots. So you could see how politically that might be a good thing to do for the Tories.
There's a pervasive sense in the papers and elsewhere at the moment that if you are friends with Tory ministers and you're friends with the government machine, it's much easier to get contracts and get jobs. And the Sunday Times investigation has a piece here about Matt Hancock's university friend who's got a role as one of his lobbyists. How big a problem is this becoming for the Conservative Party?
I think it's becoming a serious problem. The stories keep mounting up. As you said, there's the story about Matt Hancock appointing one of his Oxford mates to a role without declaring it, which I'm not sure if that's against the rules, but there's definitely a feeling that it should have been declared and wasn't. And on the same page, there's a kind of chumocratic double spread in the Sunday Times. They've also reported on the news that a former Tory councillor who was given a lucrative PPE contract to supply PPE has done very well out of it and has bought himself a lovely new house in the countryside. When you add that to the questions about the appointment of Dido Harding, about the money that the vaccinations czar Kate Bingham was spending on PR officials and so on, I mean, taken on their own, some of these stories perhaps seem a bit innocuous, but I think taken as a whole, you do get quite a stench of corruption emanating from the whole piece. Right, chumocracy, that's a new word on me. Katya, I did say at the beginning that this is really the last phase of these trade talks with the EU. I say that almost every week, it seems to be. It goes on and on and on. But this time, it's for real. Just give us your readout about what the state of play is now.
Well, one thing I'd say, Andrew, that's conspicuously absent from European papers this Sunday is the topic of Brexit. And that's because, European leaders, people across Europe are just like, hasn't it happened already? Just tell us when this is all over. And I know that a lot of our viewers are probably feeling the same way. This has to be over very soon because the transition period ends on the 31st of December. We're definitely in the last stages. Where exactly we are depends whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of person. EU ambassadors were briefed by the European Commission, that's of course negotiating on behalf of the EU with the UK, that when you're looking at the 11 working groups for this trade and security deal, 95% of the work has been agreed between the two sides. You have joint legal papers being drawn up. Sounds good, yes. But if the other 5% isn't agreed, then you can forget the 95%, sure, because the mantra of these talks for both sides is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And where you still have big disagreement is on those same three issues we've had right from the word go in these talks: on fishing rights in UK waters, on the governance of a deal, if it is ever agreed, and on competition regulations as well. Yeah. We heard from the President of the European Commission, some progress slowly is now being made here. The general expectation is a deal will be done in the next days or couple of weeks. But those political decisions need to be taken. And if an agreement is made, both sides will then have to think about PR. How do they sell this deal? Let me ask you very, very briefly, because we're sadly running out of time already, about the thing that you are being talked to about more than Brexit. You go around Europe trying to talk to people about Brexit, but they don't want to talk about Brexit. They want to talk about what most of the UK is also talking about, which is the Crown. Absolutely. You know, there's me dining up trying to talk to diplomats, politicians in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe. Everybody's hooked. Even European papers are talking about it. You've got Die Welt newspaper calling it flawless and masterful. Der Standard in Austria saying that journalists there are completely hooked to it as well. And yes, the diplomats I speak to, there are even some of them who are trying out the accents that they hear on the Crown.
But I think it's an indication. Katya. Sounds absolutely horrendous. We're almost out of time. Andrew,
just very briefly, that whereas Brexit may have soured negotiation relations between the UK and the EU, this no way infects the Anglophile attitude of many of Europe's leaders or the affection that European people feel for culture across the UK. And you definitely see that when it comes to the Crown.
Well, that is very nice to hear, Katya. Very, very briefly, Madeline. Even so, a lot of people around the royal family, and presumably including the royal family, are absolutely spitting tacks about what they see as the rather cruel inventions in this series. Your paper's been talking about this. The Mail on Sunday is saying that the Netflix should be warning viewers the Crown has scenes that are fiction, not fact.
Yes, I mean, this is a topic that has really gripped the Telegraph in particular, but lots of other newspapers as well. We keep getting these incredible letters from readers who are pointing out some breach of protocol. We had a letter from a fishing expert who was saying that Charles had a terrible throw and it was an insult to the Prince of Wales to suggest that he would have been such a terrible fisherman. But there is a serious point here that the Daily Mail reports that a kind of coalition of royal experts, friends of the royal family and so on, have come out to say that from now on, the show The Crown should really be attached with some kind of disclaimer around it to say that this is, a fictionalized version of events. And I think actually that there is a real point to this, because for a lot of people who weren't alive for the events being portrayed in the show, this will be their kind of first acquaintance with these events. And it's still very personal. Most of the people involved in this action are still alive and it still affects people's lives. And it is worth pointing out because I think many people, this will be their first encounter with Charles and Diana in that way. I mean, people my age.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Madeline Grant and Katya Adler, thanks both very, very much for getting up and doing that for us. And so to the weather, one of those weeks when talking about the British weather seems completely meaningless because it depends where you are. Really cold, flurries of snow, or almost mild and balmy. Mild and bitter weather. Half and half. I miss the pub. Over to Chris Fawkes. Chris.
Yes, Andrew, everything but the kitchen sink wasn't there. And there will be further changes over the next few days. In fact, we've got changes even within the weekend, with much brighter weather spreading in across most parts of the UK today. But with the brighter weather comes cooler air. So temperatures down on yesterday's values. Hwarden was the warmest spot in northeast Wales, 14 degrees yesterday, about 10 today. And that drop of around 3 or 4 degrees Celsius is going to be quite widespread. But as I say, there is more in the way of sunshine, at least to compensate. Now, as we go through the day, we're going to see showers for Northern Ireland and Scotland. And given the westerly winds, those showers will push right through the central belt. So you could see 1 or 2 in Edinburgh and Dundee from time to time. But still, the lion's share of the showers will be across the northwest, where they'll continue to be quite heavy and blustery. Overnight tonight, a change in the wind direction means the showers tend to become confined to the highlands and islands, with clear spells developing elsewhere. Light winds. It's a colder night than we've seen over recent nights, with some patches of frost developing, particularly in the countryside. So a chilly start to the day on Monday, but a bright enough start, a bit of sunshine around. But then further changes. It turns cloudier, maybe a bit of hill fog for a time over the high ground, Wales, the Pennines. More general rain pushes into Northern Ireland and Scotland. And it stays quite chilly across eastern areas of the UK, but turns milder from the southwest. That milder air will be pushing across all of the UK for Tuesday, but with it comes some particularly heavy rain in western Scotland. That could cause some localised flooding. So, Andrew, further changes weather-wise in the week ahead.
There always are. Now then, on Wednesday, the Chancellor, as we heard, gets to his feet in the House of Commons and tells us what the economy looks like and what the government's going to be spending and saving money on for the next year. To give us a glimpse of where we are and what might be ahead, I spoke just before we came on air to Paul Johnson, who's Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies.
Well, we had a huge reduction in economic output in the first half of this year, probably the biggest in recorded history. It bounced back a bit in the middle of the year, but will have gone down now. The economy is at least 10% smaller now than it was a year ago. So one of the deepest recessions still, I'm afraid, in history.
And we've borrowed an eye-watering amount of money to deal with the pandemic as well, haven't we?
At least 350 billion this year, probably, depending on what the government does over the next few months. That would make it, as a fraction of national income, the most we have ever borrowed outside of the First and Second World Wars. So we thought what we saw back in the financial crisis was huge, but this is much, much bigger.
So does that mean that we've got to stop borrowing? We can't borrow our way out of this any further?
Well, we'll clearly have to reduce borrowing at some point. At the moment, I think the government is right. Clearly, we need to support the economy, particularly whilst we have lockdown, and that may well mean more borrowing this year. It's clearly going to mean more borrowing over the next 2 or 3 years, far more borrowing than we were expecting a year ago. But if we continue with the sorts of levels of spending and tax that we've got at the moment, with a smaller economy into the medium run, then not only will borrowing be high, but the debt will be rising, and that becomes unsustainable at some point. So eventually, yes, we're going to have to rein back and have some kind of fiscal retrenchment, which probably will mean at some point some tax rises.
So if we don't start to pay off the debt within a relatively short period of time by raising taxes, then the danger is that interest rates shoot up and, in effect, the country eventually becomes bankrupt.
Well, it depends what we mean by a relatively short time. My view is that we're not going to need to do anything very much at all this year and probably next. And we're probably looking into the middle years of the 2020s. But we need a clear route to doing that. And as I say, we don't know at what point this becomes unsustainable. But as and when it does, and if it does, then the consequences really can be dreadful. And don't forget, over the medium run, we've got an ageing population. We're going to have increasing pressures on health and social care and pensions, even above what we've seen recently, and a smaller economy than we expected. In that world, we do need at some point to take action. There really is eventually no choice about that. The big choice, the big judgment, and it's a terribly tough one, is when to start taking that action.
All around the world, countries are borrowing lots of money because of this pandemic. Who are they borrowing it from? Who are the ultimate creditors?
Well, that's an extraordinarily good question. I mean, one thing that central banks around the world are doing are buying up government debt, and that's certainly the case in the UK, where the Bank of England will be knocking on for £1 trillion worth of government debt very soon. Beyond that, you've got companies and individuals and pension funds buying this stuff. There seems to be a huge appetite for it at the moment, which is partly a reflection of the extent to which people are worried about putting money into private, into equity and so on, worries about where that might go in the future. But with central banks holding such a large quantity of debt, at some point, and again, I suspect this will be a very long way down the road, one would expect them to be selling that again.
All right, a dangerous assertion, but by and large, people are adults and they can see what's going on. They can see the effect of coronavirus on Britain and on our economy. Is this the time for a government to start to level with people and say, unfortunately, to do all of the things we've done, eventually we're going to have to raise your taxes, and for people to accept that some kind of tax raising is going to be necessary to pay off the debt?
I think that probably is right. I think it's not right to scare people with the idea that this is going to happen immediately. And I think it's absolutely right. The government's clear it will do what it needs to do in the short run to support jobs and to support the economy. But getting the message right is really important. I think giving people the impression this is going to happen in the next few months or possibly even next year could be exactly the wrong signal. I think the right signal is to say that the economy will be supported until such time as things are returning to normal. And then we have to start thinking about what we're going to do with the tax system.
Paul, finally, Brexit. It's a dangerous thing to say. We are probably in the final stages of the talks about the trade deal. Have you modelled, as the IFS, have you modelled the effects of the deal that we are trying to strike on the economy and indeed the effects of not striking a deal with the EU on the British economy?
Well, even the best deal that we're likely to get at the moment would have counted as one of the hardest imaginable Brexits 3 or 4 years ago when we started to look at this. So that sort of deal will result in the economy at best growing less quickly than it otherwise would have done. And the best estimates I've seen of the impact of no deal is that it may well take 1% or 2% off the size of the economy next year. So in normal times, that might have been enough to tip us from modest growth into a shallow recession. But it is worth saying, as with everything else, and particularly in the context of coronavirus, there's just enormous uncertainty about what the impact's going to be. And I should say particularly a huge amount of uncertainty about what the short-run impact of a no-deal Brexit's likely to be. But overall, the economy to some extent has benefited from low exchange rates over the last 3 or 4 years. We've had some of the cost of Brexit built in, but there's plenty of cost probably, stressed with the uncertainty around, there's probably cost still to come.
Well, thank goodness for low interest rates. Paul Johnson, thanks very much to you as well for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, watching that with me in the studio is Anneliese Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor. Before we come on to the economy directly, Anneliese Dodds, it's fairly clear this morning that the Prime Minister is going to announce a relaxation after this lockdown, which will allow shops and many businesses to reopen. That is presumably good news that you would welcome and vote for.
Well, it will be good news if we can be moving safely into a different system of restrictions and out of this lockdown. But we've really got to learn lessons from what happened previously. There wasn't sufficient clarity around the previous tier system. We saw economic support lagging some time after announcements made around the tiered system. In fact, we saw a real series of conflicts actually with local leaders, different areas being pitted against each other. We cannot have that again. I really hope that when the Prime Minister sets out that plan, there will be much more clarity about why different areas might end up in different tiers, what support will be available for businesses, and obviously we'll look at those plans very, very carefully from that point of view.
There's a lot of worry, particularly among Tory MPs at the moment, about the future for pubs and restaurants if they're forced to stay shut between now all the way through to Christmas. Looking at the numbers, what happens is now dependent upon the Labour Party's votes. Are you going to vote for the government proposals more or less whatever happens?
Well, no, because we need to see the detail of those proposals. As I said, we really expect government needs to have learned from what's happened previously, all the problems we've had previously. We did not have a clear system of restrictions. There was a huge amount of ambiguity. And as I said, the economic support trailed the announcement of those restrictions. That has meant that there's a situation where we've seen record redundancies actually across our country over the last quarter. Businesses have gone bust that didn't need to because of those problems. So we expect that the Prime Minister should provide something far more robust on Wednesday.
So last time round people said that we needed to see the criteria by which these tiers were being decided and there should be local involvement. Presumably that's what you want. If you don't see that and if you don't see sufficient economic support for the new restrictions, will you join with Tory backbenchers to vote them down?
Well, look, we'll be assessing this very, very carefully. And you're absolutely right. We weren't provided with clear criteria around the conditions under which different areas would be moving into these tiers or out of them. We weren't provided with that clarity around what support would be there for businesses. When you think about the situation for a restaurateur, for example, before that system was brought in, you would have had a situation where, for example, an employer didn't know whether their staff were going to be receiving 80% of their previous wage, 67%, 77%, or back to work as normal.
In Europe, isn't it?
Well, actually, we've had so much chopping and changing around this, Andrew. That's the point that I'm getting at. We've had, 5 changes to that initial winter economic plan that was set out by the Chancellor, and we've only just got into winter. This is not the kind of approach that we should be seeing right now.
Well, let's talk about one thing we do probably know, which is there's going to be a freeze on public sector pay increases. Why shouldn't there be a freeze on public sector pay increases when you consider that people in the private sector, very often younger workers, have actually lost money and lost position compared to the public sector? The public sector, through this, has done relatively well compared to the private sector. Why not accept that?
Well, I would say, first of all, that we don't know if this is exactly what government will be putting in front of us in their comprehensive spending review. Very, very often we see different proposals being floated in the press and they don't actually come to pass. But you're right, we have seen incredible pressures on jobs in the UK, record redundancies in the third quarter, and in fact, the worst downturn in the G7. But how do we deal with that? I very much agree with what Paul Johnson just said. The worst possible thing that could be done, the IMF is very clear on this as well, is to put the brakes on hard now, slam the car into reverse, because what will be done... OK, go ahead.
If I can just interrupt for a second.
Sure.
It's clear, given where the public sector finances are, some tough decisions have to be taken. Freezing public sector pay would save a huge amount of money, 23 billion or whatever it is, over the next couple of years, a massive amount of money. And I just put you, as a question of fairness and equity, when you see what's happened to workers in the private sector, that is a reasonable way to start to make some savings, isn't it?
Well, with respect, that estimation was put forward by a think tank, and they didn't take into account the impact of this on our high streets and small businesses in particular. What this measure would do is it would say to our firefighters, hospital porters, teaching assistants that they will have less spending power in the future. That means they won't be spending in our high streets, they won't be spending in our small businesses. And that's a very, very good way of knocking confidence out of our economy at a time when, as I said, the UK is an outlier. Our economic downturn has been deeper than that in the rest of the G7. What needs to be done now by government is to build economic confidence up, not shoot it down.
I'm still slightly confused as to whether you think there should or shouldn't be a freeze on public sector wages.
Well, to be clear, I do not believe that there should be that freeze right now. I think that's economically very damaging. It's an irresponsible choice. I believe that it's wrong for the Chancellor, if that is what he will be going ahead with, to be pitting different groups of workers against each other, when, as I said, the implication of this for our high streets, for our small businesses, would be very negative because it would knock confidence out of our local economies.
Your leader, Keir Starmer, has said that his number one priority is to restore the faith and confidence of the Jewish community in the Labour Party. Do you think that Jeremy Corbyn is the biggest obstacle to doing that?
Well, actually, we saw in that AHRC report that this is a problem for all of our party. It's something that the entire party needs to deal with. We need to get those disciplinary processes sorted out as a matter of urgency. I have to say it's a matter of enormous shame for our party that we've ended up in that situation where the EHRC has had to investigate us, make those recommendations. Now we need to ensure that they're put into place as a matter of urgency.
A former chairman of the party, somebody I'm sure you know well, Ian Lavery, has said that Keir Starmer has a personal and political vendetta against the former leader, Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, I don't agree with Ian on that. I agree with him on many other things, but I certainly do not agree with him on that. We need to make sure that we demonstrate as a party to the Jewish community that we have learned from that EHRC report. And let's be absolutely clear what this is about. This is about a political party being investigated, having been found not to have stood up for Jewish people, to have not had those processes to root out anti-Semitism. We have got to deal with this robustly. Keir quite rightly has been dealing with it robustly.
But the consequences for the party might be very serious. It's not just Ian Lavery. The Bakers Union, for instance, has talked about vindictive and divisive attacks and has threatened to disaffiliate. Many people inside the party are talking about Labour descending into civil war. Is it really worth it?
Well, I have to say, for me, the really critical thing is to ensure that we're not in a situation where we're investigated by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, a body that was set up under Labour for having had processes that allowed racism to continue within our party. That is more important than any other consideration. We cannot continue like that.
It's just that for people watching who don't know the details, this seems like a complete mess. Jeremy Corbyn is an MP. he is removed from the Labour Party or suspended from the Labour Party. He's then brought back into the Labour Party, but because he's not given the Labour whip, he's not a Labour MP. So he's Labour and he's an MP, but he's not a Labour MP. It just looks like a terrible mess.
Well, of course it's frustrating. I have to say, from my point of view, what I really would have wanted us to be doing, and I know that Keir is in this position as well, is actually getting on with implementing those recommendations. This is about much more than any one person. And actually, the EHRC said very, very clearly that these processes had to be sorted out so they applied equally to everyone. That's what we need to get a grip on. Obviously, the debate is focused around one person now, but it's got to be about the whole system changing so we can show the Jewish community that they can have faith in us, that we will be able to represent them and that they can be members of our party and do so and feel comfortable in our party. That's what we need to do.
Anneliese Dodds, thanks very much indeed for coming in this morning. Now then, Judi Dench has been as busy as ever during lockdown. Her new movie, based on Noel Coward's blithe spirit, will be appearing on our screens in a matter of weeks. And Dame Judi's meanwhile been spearheading a charity fundraiser to help out-of-work theatre people during these difficult times. She joined me from her home earlier, and she told me about the stellar cast who've assembled for one night only.
Well, it's a great cast, and they are very good friends. It's Ken Branagh and Ian McKellen and Derek Jacobi and Maggie Smith and myself. We can't appear on a stage and we can't be in a studio and things, but we can be on this extraordinary thing called Zoom. But the prospect of this is actually very frightening indeed. It's like, it's an actor's nightmare, because it's like, get in your dressing room, being got into a costume and them saying, hurry up, get on. And you say, yes, but what's the play? You see, we don't know what the play is. But there we are. We're all going to be together. And it's for a very good cause, which is called Acting for Others. And it does go to the people who, all self-employed and who not necessarily act, but work in the theatre and keep the theatres going.
You made your professional debut at the Old Vic in 1957, and since then you've had all sorts of triumphs on the stage and on screen. But I'm interested in the other side of things. What was your worst experience on stage? And are you going to be talking about that?
Oh, Lord. Oh, I got into severe trouble, Andrew, because nerves make you very... they make you behave rather badly. So if anyone ever says anything that is not in the script or dries or anything, I go to pieces. So I've had a lot of those. I said once to Michael in The Merchant of Venice, we were just married, Michael and I. We were at Stratford, and I said, the line is, I speak too long, but 'tis to pease the time, to eke it and to draw it out in length. To stay you from election is the word, but election wasn't the word. I said to stay you from erection. And the Stratford Wind Band very quietly left the stage.
Well, let me ask you about theatre generally. The government has been pretty generous in its attitude to the theatre, 250 million quid, but you say that's not enough.
I don't know. I don't know when the time will be that we'll all be back on stage again. I can't imagine when it will be. We naturally want more, but then so does everybody. But, it does bring a huge revenue to the country. And people during this lockdown, of course, have turned to watching television and old films and new films and whatever they can. And actors have got together in all sorts of forms in order to entertain the public. And so that's partly why this is Acting for Others is important, as well as all the people in the theatres keep the theatres going.
Can you see yourself back on stage anytime soon?
Who knows? But I could say that every year, Andrew. I never know what's coming next. Who knows? But I hope very, very much for all those young people who are coming out of drama school and wanting to start jobs and being eager about it, and they can't do anything. And we need to help them, and we need to encourage them, and we need to keep the kind of flame going.
Dame Judi, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
And you can join Dame Judi along with that other stellar cast of greats in A Night to Remember next Sunday at 7 p.m. A limited number of tickets are available via Lockdown Theatre. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, is with me now. Welcome, Chancellor.
Good morning,
Can I ask you, first of all, something I asked Paul Johnson earlier in the show. What is your overall view of where the economy is in terms of the big numbers, borrowing, unemployment, growth and so forth? Where are we now?
Well, we'll get a clear sense next week when we do the spending review, and alongside that, the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility will publish their forecast. But I can tell you it's a very difficult picture. The economy is experiencing significant stress. We've seen that particularly in the labour market with people's jobs. We know that 750,000 people have tragically already lost their jobs, with forecasts of more to come. Borrowing, we saw the numbers last week at a record peacetime levels already, and more stress to come. And that is it's very sad to see. It's not just numbers on a chart. It's people's lives. It's their livelihoods, their security that's being impacted, and it's something that we're going to grapple with for a while to come, sadly.
Lots to talk about. Before we do, a lot of people watching simply want to know, is it absolutely clear that this lockdown ends on December the 2nd, no matter what the level of infections or even death rates?
Yes, that is absolutely right. Prime Minister's been crystal clear on that. And indeed, as a matter of law, that is what will happen. The regulations expire on that date. And the Prime Minister will be making a statement tomorrow and setting out further plans. But we will be going back into a more localised approach, a tiered system, which I think is enormously welcome. It's
a much tougher tiered system.
Yes, I mean, and what people should realise is we learn more as we go through this crisis. And as we get more data, more information, we can see what works well, what doesn't, and essentially evolve our response to make sure it's as effective as it can be. But I think the crucial thing is a localised response is something that is entirely preferable, and that's what we will go back to after the 2nd.
For most people, is their local pub, their local restaurant going to have to stay closed until Christmas?
Well, so the Prime Minister will set out more details about that this week. But you talk about pubs and restaurants. The hospitality industry has been one that has been acutely impacted by what's happened over the past few months. I'm aware of that. It employs 2 million people. It's an important part of our economy and a part of our social life as well. And we will constantly have it at the top of our mind.
I mean, the reason I'm asking you as Chancellor about this is that so many of these businesses make their profits between now and Christmas or shortly after Christmas. And if they can't open, they will go probably forever. And so it's a massive, massive economic question as to how much of the economy you're going to allow as a government to keep going between now and Christmas and possibly make the money that allows them to survive into next year and the year after that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And particularly for retail, it is November and December are very important months for the calendar. We've put a lot of support into these sectors, and you'll know the various initiatives we've done, the VAT cuts, tax cuts, business rates, holidays, cash grants, and that continues through the winter, whether it's the furlough programme or indeed the direct cash grants for hospitality and leisure businesses, whether they're open or closed, that will help them tide through. But it is difficult, and we have that in our mind. There are lots of impacts of the crisis, and it's right that we have all of them in our mind as we make these decisions.
Before this lockdown, 20% of the population of England were under Tier 3, which meant their pubs were closed. Is that going to be the same after the lockdown?
Well, the Prime Minister is going to make more announcements about the process for this next week, so I don't want to preempt that.
Idea. I mean, there's a lot of people watching who are just desperate to know.
I know they are, and I appreciate that. And there's a cabinet meeting later today which will discuss these, and then the Prime Minister will set out the details next week. So I appreciate people are eager for information, but I would say is, I think the most important thing to know is we're exiting these national restrictions and going back to this localised approach, which is definitely better.
What about shops? Will non-essential shops, the places we go to buy our Christmas presents between now and Christmas, will they be allowed to be reopened?
Again, I'm sorry, but not to be able to give you the precise answer. But so you made an important point.
No.
Yeah. Well, so we're having a cabinet discussion later on this afternoon to make final decisions. So it would be wrong for me to preempt that, and the Prime Minister will set these out from tomorrow. But you make an important point about the importance of retail to our economy and this time of year, and we will have all these things in our mind.
Presumably, as the Chancellor, you would like to see as much open as possible.
Oh, of course, from an economic perspective, as you rightly said, restrictions on businesses' ability to trade is enormously damaging, not just for them, but for the people that they employ. And it's right that we have that in our mind as we think about getting the balance between these things right.
One relatively small thing which caused a huge amount of comment was the 10 p.m. curfew. Is that going to go?
It's definitely something that we're looking at. And I think, as I said, one of the things that we've been able to do as we've learned is get data, see what works and see where we can improve things. I think it's probably fair to say when we introduced the curfew, that was something that was in common with many other countries and cities around the world. But as we've learned more, there are opportunities for us to look and refine things. And that is one of the things on our list.
Earlier on in the programme, Paul Johnson was talking about the overarching shape of the economy. And he said this huge, huge wall of debt that we've now accumulated, it has to be paid off, has to be paid down, but probably not yet, maybe not for a few years. It's still the time to carry on spending for a bit to support the economy, and then we will all have to pay higher taxes eventually to pay for it. Is that, broadly speaking, the truth?
Well, I'll give you my view of it, and I think now is the right time to focus on responding to the crisis, and that means, yes, we will be borrowing, quite frankly, an enormous sum this year to help us do that, but that is the right thing to do for the long-term health of the economy and public finances, and we're doing that to protect people's jobs, their livelihoods, support businesses, as we've talked about, but also provide the funds necessary to fight coronavirus, and that will be at the centre of the spending review next week. We'll be providing those funds, whether it's for testing, for vaccines, for the NHS, and that's the right thing to do now, and that is an approach that's been endorsed by the IMF, the OBR, and the Bank of England and others.
What is the avoidable evil in terms of the health service that you're offering more money to get round or avoid?
Well, today we've announced that we will make available an extra £3 billion on top of the record settlement that the NHS anyway is enjoying, and that's to tackle some of the backlog of things that have built up over the past few months as we were dealing with coronavirus. So that will mean that we can do 1 million more treatments, for more scans, more elective surgery. We've also made more money available for diagnostic equipment to replace some of the older ones. But that illustrates, again, what are one of the other impacts of tackling coronavirus was all these things that were meant to happen that couldn't sadly happen, and it's right that we make a start on tackling that back. And for everyone in their different ways through this. We've put a range of different support in place right at the beginning of this when there was such acute anxiety and worry for the country. But the good news is that support lasts all the way to next spring, and that is there alongside lots of other things we've done, helping with people's council tax bills, mortgage holidays.
Is that going to go forward?
It was a temporary increase that lasts all the way to next spring, in line with many of our measures, by the way, to support whether it's furlough or business rates, holidays. As we get through this and we have more certainty about the future, we can decide what the best way to support the economy, businesses, and then crucially people's jobs and their livelihoods, and we'll make those decisions as we go through.
Let me ask you about the furlough, because back in September you said it's fundamentally wrong to hold people in jobs that only exist inside the furlough. Going forward, isn't that exactly what you're now doing?
I think that, what changed is that the restrictions that we needed to put in place obviously became more severe, and we're back in essentially for the last month, we've had national restrictions that have again closed large swathes of our economy down. That's what's changed. At the time that we made those decisions to move away from furlough to a new system, we were in the process of opening up the economy, believing that test and trace could help suppress the spread of the virus and we could use a localized approach. Now, if we're in that world, then it's absolutely right that we evolve our support to allow people to work and encourage work. But when the economy is now, as it is, closed down, that approach isn't right, and it's right that we evolved it as the health restrictions changed.
Now, one of the more controversial aspects of the support you've been given is support for self-employed people, because there's a huge number of people, 3 million or so, who haven't had the self-employment help early on. And it looks as if part of the trouble has been that the system wasn't well designed first time round, and you just brought in the same system again second time round. There's a lot of unhappiness up and down the country about people who thought that they deserved the help, and the IFS and others have done work on the numbers of this, so it's not lobbyists talking, it's proper economic analysis. Lots of people have not had the support they deserve and need, and some of them are in desperate straits.
So let's take a step back. I think our support for self-employed has been more comprehensive and generous than almost any other country in the world. Between 3.5 and 4 million people have been eligible for that support. And I probably would slightly take issue with the idea that 3 million people have been excluded, as you said. I think actually your BBC reality fact check thing looked at this, and the largest number of those people are actually people who are not majority self-employed, which means they're actually they make more money from employment rather than self-employment.
Yeah, but they may still have a huge gap.
Well, hang on.
If I rest back, not on anybody else's figures, but IFS and other figures, it says 7 out of 8 workers don't qualify for the £500 payment for self-isolation, for instance.
So that's something different. But let's just talk about the self-employment issue. And so of the 3 million people, the majority of those who you said are excluded are not. It's just that they're not majority self-employed. Now, Paul Johnson, as you said, thinks that we should be targeted. That's one way of targeting that support on those who predominantly make their earnings from self-employment. Now, of those, I think it's around 1.5 million people who don't make the majority of their income from self-employment.
I asked Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, about that. He said it's not really my responsibility. As it were, wait till Rishi Sunak's in the studio. So here I am with you.
Well, I think. Well, first of all, I think it's very difficult to be precise about the near-term effects. But I'd agree with what the Prime Minister has said. Look, in the short term specifically, and most immediately, it would be preferable to have a deal because it wouldn't ease things in the short term. But I think the most important impact on our economy next year is not going to be from that. It's because of coronavirus. It's what we started talking about at the beginning of this interview, and the scale of economic shock that we are experiencing as a result of that is really the dominant thing, and that's why all my attention is focused on trying to protect as many jobs as possible through that, provide the support to people and businesses through
the reason I want to hover over a little bit over Brexit is that is something that politicians, as it were, are responsible for, which they're not responsible for coronavirus. Now, there was modelling done by thanks to Andy Street, the Conservative mayor, up in the West Midlands. Birmingham University modelled the effect of no deal and tariffs on the car economy in the West Midlands, and that said there could be a drop of more than 12% of the GDP of the West Midlands economy if we face those tariffs. That is a huge hit for an area we're supposed to be levelling up.
So I haven't seen that particular report, so I can't comment on the precise details. But what would I say is we had this debate a while ago. We had a referendum on it, then we had an election on it, and we've now left the European Union. Are we
have it in our power to have either to go a little bit further to get some kind of deal or not? And I'm just looking at the effects of not.
Yeah, well, we should not be going for a deal at any price. That would be the wrong thing to do. And I think there are things that are important to us in these negotiations. And we've been entirely, as I said, I think reasonable,
nobody's saying a deal at any price.
And transparent. Well, ultimately, that's what it comes down to. We're in a negotiation. I think we've been reasonable, consistent and transparent throughout the process about our asks, which, by the way, are very simple. We just want pretty much the same treatment as most other countries that do trade deals with the EU get. So, as I said, I think hopefully we can find a constructive place. But I'm very confident about the British economy in all circumstances when I think longer term. I made a speech recently about the opportunities in financial services for us to do things differently. We recently announced a bidding process for free ports, again, an economic innovation that will drive jobs and growth in areas around our country. We now have a new immigration regime that we can put in place as a result of leaving. Those are all the opportunities people voted for, and those are the opportunities we are delivering.
Okay, let's come a little bit further, closer to home. Is it right that if I have government contracts, or I know senior Conservatives, I am 10 times more likely to get a contract for PPE than if I don't?
Well, look, I don't know specifically that number, but I would say, let's think back to the start of this crisis, right? Those days in late March, early April. And you all remember, I'm sure, whether it was me or others on your show, we spent our time, desperately worried about PPE and everything else. And on the economic side, I was also reacting very quickly. So,
but you just said to me, not at any cost about Brexit. I put the same thing back to you when it comes to contracts. The Department of Health paid a company called Ayanda Capital £155 million for 50 million face masks, which couldn't fit government specifications and couldn't therefore be used. Was that a good use of government money?
Well, so let's go back to that period when this is what dominated everything that we were talking about. And so do I think at that moment the right thing, either on the economic side or on the health side, would have been to say, well, let's run a procurement process for 30 or 60 days? Or do I think the right thing was to act fast? Whether it's on the economic side is what I did. I acted broadly and knowing that we were going to do things that were right for a crisis. I do believe that was the right thing to do.
No one's against acting fast, but acting fast to buy face masks that don't work and spending all that kind of money on that, a company which did have a particular connection with the government, seems to a lot of people simply a misuse of public money.
Well, as I said, I was involved in this particular contract. There's obviously a process that all these contracts go through. But when you're in the midst of a crisis and we're trying to ensure that we have enough PPE, whether it was for care homes at the time or the country more generally, it was right to try and do everything we can. And I'm not going to apologise for us reacting in that way. I think it's all fine now to look back. But at that moment, every time someone was on your show or anyone else, what people wanted to know is, do we have enough PPE to keep our health workers safe? And that's what we were trying to do.
You have a very stressful life. Have you ever unintentionally bullied anyone?
Look, obviously bullying is not appropriate and it's not an effective way to get the best out of people.
But if somebody in your office, which is a very, very busy office, was shouting and swearing, would they keep their job?
Look, I don't think shouting is an effective way to get the best out of people, but it is necessary sometimes to be direct in order to drive progress in an organisation, particularly under stressful circumstances. But I think
we both know we're talking about
exactly. So why don't we just address the specific issue? Yeah.
Yes, it is said that the Prime Minister had asked the official concerned in this report to water down the language. Would that have been an appropriate thing to do?
Well, that's not what happened. And the independent advisor conducted a detailed review at the request of the Prime Minister because he takes this matter very seriously, and that's right because it is a serious issue. And that review concluded. The findings have been published. The Prime Minister has spent a lot of time considering them in the round, has reached the conclusion that Priti is not a bully, and she has offered a full and unreserved apology for what's happened. And as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, that draws a line under this, and we should get back to focusing on what people want, which is tackling crime and making sure that our communities are safe. And on a personal level, I've worked closely with Priti and found her to be entirely kind and very focused and passionate about what she does.
Rishi Sunak, thanks very much indeed for coming in and talking today. That's all from me. Thanks for watching and thanks to all my guests. I'll be back next week and we'll be speaking to Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. But until then, goodbye.